September 17th, 1939, Polish territory, under German and Soviet control. 5 a.m., German operations on the Western Front. German panzer divisions continue advancing eastward, occupying the remaining Polish territories. After days of continuous Luftwaffe bombing and ground attacks, the Polish army has effectively ceased to exist as an organized fighting force. Germany secures full control over western Poland. Around 300,000 German soldiers, supported by approximately 600 Panzer III and Panzer IV tanks, operate across the region. Nearly 2,000 Luftwaffe aircraft maintain aerial reconnaissance and bombing missions. Following the destruction of Warsaw, Krakow, and Lwow, German forces moved toward the Romanian border, aiming to seal off the last potential refuge for Polish units. 9 a.m., Soviet invasion of eastern Poland. In accordance with the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, the Soviet Union launches a full invasion of eastern Poland. Soviet forces under General Timoshenko advance rapidly into eastern territories, including Lwow and Brest-Litovsk. Approximately 500,000 Soviet soldiers, supported by around 300 BT-7 and T-26 tanks, cross the frontier. About 1,000 Soviet aircraft provide air support. Eastern Poland is effectively absorbed into the Soviet sphere of control as scattered Polish units attempt, without success, to resist both invaders. 1 p.m., German losses during the advance on Lwow and Brest. German casualties during operations around Lwow and Brest remain relatively limited. Polish forces lack the equipment and ammunition necessary for sustained resistance. Roughly 1,000 German soldiers are killed or wounded, while approximately 30 German tanks are damaged during isolated Polish counterattacks. German units now control most of Poland and prepare for further security operations toward Romania. 4 p.m., civilian casualties in Lwow and Brest. Continuous air raids and ground fighting cause further civilian losses. Between 6,000 and 8,000 civilians are killed in Lwow and Brest. An estimated 15,000 to 20,000 civilians attempt to flee southwest toward Romania. Evacuation becomes a matter of survival as air attacks, ground advances, and collapsing infrastructure place civilians in constant danger. 6 p.m. Polish armed forces withdraw into Romania. With Polish military resistance crushed across both western and eastern fronts, remaining units withdraw into Romania. The Polish government in exile begins organizing forces abroad while seeking assistance from Britain and France. Approximately 30,000 Polish soldiers form the nucleus of the exile army. Between 25,000 and 30,000 civilians cross into Romanian territory alongside retreating units. 9 p.m., Polish government and resistance from abroad. The Polish government consolidates its position in Romania and begins formal preparations for resistance abroad. Plans are laid for cooperation with Western allies against both Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. Around 25,000 Polish soldiers are now organized in exile, while civilian refugees continue to arrive from occupied territory. Diplomatic efforts intensify with Britain, France, and the United States. Summary of September 17th, 1939. September 17th marks the final collapse of the Polish state under coordinated German and Soviet occupation. Poland is divided between two totalitarian powers, with no remaining organized resistance on home soil. As civilian suffering increases and occupation regimes take control, the Polish struggle transitions into exile. The foundations of long-term resistance are laid abroad, ensuring that Poland's fight continues beyond its occupied borders. September 18th, 1939. The Polish army in exile, German and Soviet control secured a.m. German advance and consolidation of control. German armies continue consolidating control over Polish territory. Following the rapid eastern advance, German forces under Generals von Rundstedt and Guderian secure full control over western Poland, including Warsaw and Krakow. Around 250,000 German soldiers, supported by approximately 700 Panzer III and Panzer IV tanks, occupy key regions. About 1,500 Luftwaffe aircraft maintain air superiority and continue limited bombing and reconnaissance missions. With organized Polish resistance eliminated, Germany focuses on stabilizing occupied territory and coordinating control with the Soviet Union in the east. 9 a.m. The Polish army in exile. The Polish army, now regrouped in Romania, continues organizing resistance abroad. The Polish government in exile intensifies diplomatic efforts with Britain, France, and the United States, seeking military and political support. Approximately 30,000 Polish soldiers form the core of the emerging exile forces. At the same time, between 25,000 and 30,000 Polish civilians cross into Romania, fleeing occupation and destruction. The Polish leadership begins the process of political and military reorganization with the long-term goal of restoring Polish independence. 1 p.m., Soviet advance in eastern Poland. With Germany securing the west, the Soviet Union continues its advance across eastern Poland. Following the occupation of Brest-Litovsk and Lwów, Soviet forces established new administrative and military structures in occupied territories. Around 500,000 Soviet soldiers, supported by roughly 300 BT-7 and T-26 tanks, remain deployed across eastern Poland. Nearly 1,000 Soviet aircraft operate over the region. Soviet authorities begin enforcing control, while the local population faces repression, arrests, and forced compliance. 4 p.m. German losses during the Siege of Warsaw. German losses during operations in Warsaw and Krakow remain relatively limited. Polish defensive positions are fragmented, demoralized, and unable to sustain resistance. Approximately 1,500 German soldiers are killed or wounded during final engagements, and around 25 German tanks suffer damage during isolated urban fighting. Remaining Polish units either surrender or disperse, marking the end of organized resistance in central Poland. 6 p.m. Civilian casualties in Warsaw and Lwów. Continued air attacks and ground operations inflict further suffering on the civilian population. Between 8,000 and 10,000 civilians are killed in Warsaw and Lwów as a result of bombardment, artillery fire, and street fighting. An estimated 25,000 to 30,000 civilians continue attempting to flee toward Romania and neighboring regions. Evacuation routes remain dangerous, and shortages of food, medical care, and shelter worsen the humanitarian crisis. 9 p.m. Polish government in exile and diplomatic efforts. The Polish government in exile expands diplomatic activity, formally seeking military assistance from Britain and France. The foundations of long-term resistance are laid abroad, as Poland's struggle transitions from territorial defense to exile-based warfare and diplomacy. Around 30,000 Polish soldiers are now organized outside the country, while civilian refugees continue arriving in Romania. Preparations begin for Poland's participation in the wider Allied war effort. Summary of September 18, 1939. September 18th marks the consolidation of German and Soviet control over Poland. With Polish territory fully occupied and organized resistance eliminated at home, the Polish state continues to exist only in exile. Civilian suffering intensifies across occupied cities, while the Polish government and armed forces regroup abroad. This day represents the transition from national defense to prolonged resistance from exile, as Poland prepares to continue the fight against occupation alongside the Western Allies. September 19, 1939. Poland, under total occupation, the government in exile organizes resistance. 5 a.m. German and Soviet operations across occupied Poland. German armies under Generals von Rundstedt and Guderian continue advancing eastward while consolidating full control over western Poland. Following the occupation of Warsaw, Krakow, Lwów, and Brest, German divisions focus on securing the entirety of western Polish territory and finalizing the occupation. Approximately 350,000 German soldiers remain deployed, supported by around 600 Panzer III and Panzer IV tanks. Nearly 2,000 Luftwaffe aircraft maintain air superiority and conduct repeated air patrols and bombing missions. With organized Polish resistance eliminated, Germany concentrates on stabilizing control while coordinating borders with Soviet forces in the east. 9 a.m. Soviet forces secure eastern Poland. The Soviet army under General Timoshenko continues occupying eastern Poland, completing its advance into key regions. Roughly 500,000 Soviet soldiers, supported by approximately 300 BT-7 and T-26 tanks, control the eastern half of the country. Around 1,000 Soviet aircraft operate above the region. In cities such as Lwów and Brest-Litovsk, Soviet authorities establish communist administrative structures, enforce military rule, and secure the eastern frontier. Polish military forces in the east have fully withdrawn, leaving no organized resistance behind. 1 p.m. German losses. During the final fighting in central Poland, German casualties during the final fighting around Warsaw and Krakow remain comparatively low as Polish defensive capabilities have collapsed. Approximately 1,200 German soldiers are killed or wounded during remaining engagements. Around 20 Panzer IV tanks sustained damage during isolated urban resistance. Following the occupation of Warsaw, Krakow, and Katowice, German forces prepared to complete the consolidation of power and eliminate the last scattered Polish formations. 4 p.m. Civilian casualties in western Poland. Air raids and ground operations continue to inflict heavy losses on the civilian population. In Warsaw and Krakow, between 6,000 and 8,000 civilians are killed as a result of bombardment, artillery fire, and street fighting. An estimated 20,000 to 30,000 civilians attempt to flee toward Romania. Continuous air attacks, destroyed infrastructure, and blocked roads make evacuation extremely dangerous, trapping many civilians inside occupied cities. 6 p.m. The Polish army in exile. From Romania, the Polish army begins consolidating its forces abroad. The Polish government in exile initiates a coordinated effort to organize resistance against both Germany and the Soviet Union. Approximately 30,000 Polish soldiers now form the core of the exile forces. At the same time, between 25,000 and 30,000 Polish civilians cross into Romania seeking safety. Plans are developed to rebuild Polish military units and continue the struggle alongside Western allies. 9 p.m. The Polish government in exile and organized resistance. The Polish government in exile intensifies diplomatic and military planning. With Poland fully occupied, resistance efforts shift entirely abroad. Diplomatic missions focus on securing international recognition and military support for the restoration of Polish independence. Around 30,000 Polish soldiers are now organized outside the country, while the flow of civilian refugees into Romania continues, reaching as many as 35,000 people. The foundations of long-term Polish resistance are firmly established beyond national borders. Summary of September 19, 1939. September 19th marks the complete occupation of Poland by Germany and the Soviet Union. With no remaining organized resistance on Polish soil, the Polish state survives only through its government and armed forces in exile. Civilian suffering continues to rise under occupation, while diplomatic and military resistance takes shape abroad. This day confirms the transformation of Poland's struggle from a national defense into a prolonged fight for survival and independence conducted beyond its borders. September 20th, 1939, the Polish army in exile, Germany and the Soviet Union. Secure full occupation 5 a.m., German operations across occupied Poland. German armies under the command of Generals von Rundstedt and Guderian now control most of Poland and continue consolidating territory in the western and southern regions. As Soviet forces secure the east, German units focus on final stabilization of occupied areas. Approximately 350,000 German soldiers remain deployed, supported by around 600 Panzer III and Panzer IV tanks. Nearly 2,000 Luftwaffe aircraft maintain air superiority, conducting patrols and suppression strikes. With the Polish army destroyed and dispersed, Poland is effectively divided between Germany and the Soviet Union. 9 a.m. Soviet control in eastern Poland. Following earlier advances, the Soviet army under General Timoshenko completes its occupation of eastern Poland. Roughly 500,000 Soviet soldiers, supported by around 300 BT-7 and T-26 tanks, control the region. About 1,000 Soviet aircraft operate over eastern territories. Communist administrative structures are introduced, replacing former Polish governance. No organized Polish resistance remains in the east. 1 p.m. German casualties during the fighting for Warsaw and Krakow. German losses during the final fighting around Warsaw and Krakow remain limited. Approximately 1,000 German soldiers are killed or wounded, while about 20 Panzer IV tanks are damaged in isolated engagements. Polish defenders suffer severe losses due to shortages of weapons, ammunition, and organized command. With resistance eliminated, German forces concentrate on securing strategic cities and infrastructure throughout Poland. 4 p.m. Civilian casualties in Warsaw and Lwow. Continued bombing and ground operations cause further civilian suffering in Warsaw and Lwów. Between 7,000 and 9,000 civilians are killed during air raids, artillery fire, and street fighting. An estimated 20,000 to 30,000 civilians attempt to flee toward Romania. Ongoing air attacks, destroyed roads, food shortages, and lack of medical supplies make evacuation dangerous and incomplete. 6 p.m. The Polish Army in exile. From Romania, the Polish Army continues organizing resistance in exile. The Polish government initiates diplomatic efforts aimed at securing military assistance from the United States, Great Britain, and France. Approximately 30,000 Polish soldiers form the core of the exile forces, while between 25,000 and 30,000 civilians remain displaced in Romania. Plans are developed to rebuild Polish military formations abroad and continue the fight against both occupiers. 9 p.m. The Polish government in exile and diplomatic efforts. With Poland fully occupied by Germany and the Soviet Union, the Polish government in exile intensifies efforts to organize long-term resistance. Diplomatic initiatives focus on gaining international support and formal recognition of the Polish cause. Around 30,000 Polish soldiers remain organized outside the country, while the number of refugees in Romania continues to rise, reaching up to 35,000. The struggle for Poland now shifts entirely beyond its borders. Summary of September 20th, 1939. September 20th marks the full military occupation of Poland. German and Soviet forces firmly control the country, while the Polish state survives only through its government and armed forces in exile. Civilian suffering continues to escalate, and the foundations of organized resistance are laid abroad. Poland's fight for survival and independence enters a new phase, conducted far from its occupied homeland. September 21st, 1939. The Polish Army in exile, Germany and the Soviet Union. Secure occupation 5 a.m. German operations across western Poland. Following their rapid advance, German armies under the command of General von Rundstedt continue to secure full control over western Poland. With Warsaw, Krakow, and Katowice already occupied, Germany focuses on stabilizing the remaining territories. Under the terms of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, Soviet forces maintain control over eastern Poland. Approximately 350,000 German soldiers remain deployed, supported by around 600 Panzer III and Panzer IV tanks. Nearly 2,000 Luftwaffe aircraft conduct continuous patrols and strikes, maintaining complete air superiority. With the last Polish defensive positions destroyed, the systematic division of Poland between Germany and the Soviet Union moves into its final phase. 9 a.m. The Polish Army in exile. After relocating to Romania, the Polish Army in exile begins organizing resistance forces and planning a future return to the fight against the occupiers. The Polish government in exile intensifies diplomatic efforts to secure military assistance from the United States, Great Britain, and France. Around 30,000 Polish soldiers now form the core of the exile army, while between 25,000 and 30,000 civilians continue crossing into Romania. Political coordination and long-term resistance planning become central priorities as Poland's struggle shifts beyond its borders. 1 p.m. Soviet occupation in eastern Poland. The Soviet army continues advancing across eastern Poland, firmly securing control over Brest-Litovsk and Lwów. Approximately 500,000 Soviet soldiers, supported by around 250 BT-7 and T-26 tanks and roughly 1,000 aircraft, dominate the region. A new communist administration is introduced, replacing Polish civil and military authority. Polish units in the east lack the resources and coordination needed for meaningful resistance. 4 p.m. German losses. During the fighting for Warsaw and Krakow, German casualties during operations in Warsaw and Krakow remain relatively limited. Around 1,200 German soldiers are killed or wounded, while approximately 20 Panzer IV tanks sustain damage during isolated engagements with remaining Polish defenders. With organized Polish resistance effectively eliminated, German forces finalize control over urban centers and strategic infrastructure. 6 p.m. Civilian casualties in Warsaw and Krakow. Civilian suffering continues to escalate following sustained bombings and ground assaults. Between 8,000 and 10,000 civilians are killed in Warsaw and Krakow as air raids and artillery strikes devastate residential districts. An estimated 20,000 to 25,000 civilians attempt to flee toward Romania, despite destroyed roads, ongoing air attacks, and severe shortages of food and medical supplies. The humanitarian situation deteriorates rapidly across occupied Poland. 9 p.m., the Polish government in exile and the organization of resistance. The Polish government in exile settles in Romania and formally begins coordinating resistance against the occupiers. Diplomatic initiatives intensify, focusing on military support from the United States, Great Britain, and France. Approximately 30,000 Polish soldiers remain organized outside the country, while the number of Polish refugees in Romania rises to between 30,000 and 35,000. With Poland divided between two occupying powers, the foundations of long-term resistance are laid abroad. Summary of September 21st, 1939. September 21st marks the complete occupation of Poland by Germany and the Soviet Union. The Polish army has withdrawn into exile, and the Polish government continues the fight from abroad. Civilian casualties continue to rise as the country is systematically divided between two totalitarian regimes. Poland's war effort now enters a new phase, defined by resistance, diplomacy, and survival beyond its occupied homeland. September 22, 1939, the Polish army in exile as Germany and the Soviet Union consolidate full control. 5 a.m., German operations across western Poland. With Polish defensive forces in the west completely destroyed, German armies under the command of General von Rundstedt and General Guderian continue securing the western and southern regions of Poland. Warsaw, Krakow, and several other key cities have already fallen. With no Polish resistance left in the west, German divisions shift their focus to consolidating control over occupied territory. Roughly 300,000 German soldiers, supported by around 600 Panzer III and Panzer IV tanks, hold the region. Approximately 1,500 Luftwaffe aircraft maintain total air superiority and carry out constant bombing operations. German forces now turn increasingly toward the administration of conquered areas and the extension of influence toward Romania and neighboring regions. 9 a.m. The Soviet advance in eastern Poland. The Soviet army, which now controls the entire eastern portion of Poland, continues establishing communist administration across the region. Under General Timoshenko, the Soviets reinforce political and military control. Around 500,000 Soviet soldiers, supported by approximately 250 BT-7 and T-26 tanks, and nearly 1,000 aircraft, secure the eastern territories. Polish military units in the east are too depleted to mount organized resistance, and Soviet authority expands rapidly. 1 p.m., German casualties in Warsaw and Krakow. Following days of ground attacks and bombardments, German casualties in the fighting for Warsaw and Krakow remain relatively low due to the collapse of Polish defenses. Approximately 1,200 German soldiers are killed or wounded, while roughly 30 Panzer III and Panzer IV tanks suffer damage during the final engagements. With Polish resistance eliminated, German forces focus on strengthening their administrative presence and securing supply routes through occupied Poland. 4 p.m., civilian casualties in Warsaw, Krakow, and Lwów. Heavy air raids and ground assaults conducted by both German and Soviet forces continue to inflict severe losses on the civilian population. Between 8,000 and 10,000 civilians are killed across Warsaw, Krakow, and Lwów. Despite ongoing danger, between 25,000 and 30,000 civilians attempt to flee toward Romania, seeking refuge from the occupation. The humanitarian crisis deepens as essential infrastructure collapses and medical care becomes increasingly scarce. 6 p.m., the Polish government in exile and diplomatic efforts. Relocated to Romania, the Polish government in exile intensifies its diplomatic efforts to secure military and material support from the United States, Great Britain, and France. Approximately 30,000 Polish soldiers have now regrouped as the core of the exile army, while 25,000 to 30,000 civilians continue crossing into Romania. The government in exile begins formal appeals for Western intervention, hoping to build the foundation for a future liberation effort. 9 p.m., organizing resistance abroad. The Polish government in exile continues establishing new structures for resistance abroad, determined to restore Polish independence. The exile army prepares for future operations, while the political leadership seeks alignment with Western powers willing to oppose German domination and Soviet expansion. Around 30,000 soldiers now form the exile force, and between 30,000 and 35,000 civilians have relocated to Romania. As Poland remains divided between two occupying regimes, the struggle shifts from the battlefield at home to a long-term international campaign. Summary of September 22nd, 1939. September 22nd marks another day of consolidation for German and Soviet forces as they establish complete control over Poland. The Polish army continues reorganizing in exile, while the government begins large-scale diplomatic efforts to gain Western military support. Civilian casualties grow steadily, and Poland enters a new era defined by occupation, resistance abroad, and the hope for eventual liberation. September 23, 1939, the Polish army in exile as Germany and the Soviet Union complete the occupation of Poland. 5 a.m., German operations across Western Poland. Following the full occupation of Western Poland, German forces intensify the administrative consolidation of conquered territory. Troops under General von Rundstedt focus on restoring order, establishing German authority, and organizing military governance in cities such as Warsaw, Krakow, and Katowice. Roughly 350,000 German soldiers, supported by around 600 Panzer III and Panzer IV tanks and approximately 2,000 Luftwaffe aircraft, maintain firm control. German forces continue suppressing any trace of resistance among Polish civilians and scattered military remnants. 9 a.m. The Soviet army continues consolidating eastern Poland. The Soviet army, commanded by General Timoshenko, expands and strengthens its control over eastern Poland. Having already captured Brest-Litovsk, Lwów, and large sections of western Ukraine, Soviet forces now enforce communist administration across the region. Approximately 500,000 Soviet soldiers, assisted by around 300 BT-7 and T-26 tanks and roughly 1,000 aircraft, secure the territory. Polish forces in the east are entirely unable to resist, and Soviet political structures rapidly replace pre-war Polish institutions. 1 p.m., German casualties in Warsaw and Krakow. After several days of ground assaults and relentless bombardment, German losses during the encirclement and fall of Warsaw and Krakow remain relatively low due to the collapse of Polish defenses. Around 1,200 German soldiers are reported killed or wounded, with roughly 30 Panzer IV tanks damaged during the last pockets of Polish resistance. Germany now focuses on reinforcing control of occupied regions and eliminating any remaining disorder. 4 p.m., civilian casualties in Warsaw, Krakow, and Lwów. Heavy German and Soviet air raids, combined with ground attacks, continue to inflict devastating losses on the civilian population. Between 7,000 and 10,000 civilians are killed in Warsaw, Krakow, and Lwów. Despite severe danger, between 30,000 and 35,000 civilians attempt to flee toward Romania and other neighboring countries. With repeated bombardments and widespread destruction, the humanitarian situation in the cities becomes increasingly catastrophic. 6 p.m. The Polish government in exile begins organizing resistance. Now based in Romania, the Polish government in exile accelerates its efforts to organize military and diplomatic resistance against both Germany and the Soviet Union. Approximately 30,000 Polish soldiers form the core of the exile army, while between 30,000 and 35,000 civilians continue crossing into Romania. Polish leaders initiate negotiations with Britain and France, seeking military aid and political support for future operations against the occupiers. 9 p.m. Diplomatic efforts intensify. The Polish government in exile continues formal negotiations with Western powers. This day becomes a crucial point in Poland's efforts to restore sovereignty, as the leadership focuses on building alliances capable of challenging both German domination and Soviet expansion. With 30,000 soldiers available in the exile army and tens of thousands of civilians relocated to Romania, the groundwork for a long-term resistance movement is being laid. Summary of September 23, 1939. September 23rd marks another decisive step in Poland's transition from battlefield defeat to organized resistance abroad. Germany and the Soviet Union have consolidated complete control over Polish territory, while the Polish army and government relocate to exile. Civilian casualties continue to rise sharply as cities remain devastated by bombardments. The Polish government in exile turns its efforts toward diplomacy, seeking Western military aid and preparing the foundation for renewed resistance from abroad. September 24th, 1939, the Polish army in exile as Germany and the Soviet Union consolidate their control. 5 a.m. German operations on the Western Front. German armies continue securing the western regions of Poland, tightening control over every remaining sector. Following the complete destruction of Polish defensive forces in the West, Germany shifts from active combat to full administrative occupation. Military authorities begin enforcing occupation rule across all territories under German control. Approximately 350,000 German soldiers, supported by around 600 Panzer III and Panzer IV tanks and nearly 2,000 Luftwaffe aircraft, maintain order while conducting occasional air operations against the final scattered Polish positions. Organized Polish resistance in the West no longer exists. 9 a.m., the Soviet Army on the Eastern Front. Advancing steadily from the east, the Soviet Army under General Timoshenko now holds complete control over eastern Poland, including Brest-Litovsk and Lwów. Soviet forces assume responsibility for establishing communist administration across the region. Roughly 500,000 Soviet soldiers, supported by around 300 BT-7 and T-26 tanks and approximately 1,000 aircraft, enforce political and military control. Former Polish institutions are dismantled and replaced with Soviet authority. 1 p.m., German losses in Warsaw and Krakow. After days of siege and bombardment, German losses during operations in Warsaw and Krakow remain low, as Polish defenses are fully exhausted and no longer function as a fighting force. Around 1,000 German soldiers are reported killed or wounded, while approximately 30 Panzer IV tanks suffered damage during the final encounters. German forces now focus primarily on administrative consolidation rather than combat. 4 p.m. Civilian casualties in Western Poland. Continued air raids and ground operations result in mounting civilian deaths across Warsaw, Krakow, and Lwów. Between 7,000 and 10,000 civilians are killed as bombardments persist. Despite extreme danger, between 25,000 and 30,000 civilians attempt to flee toward Romania. For those remaining, daily life under occupation brings devastation, displacement, and fear. 6 p.m., the Polish government in exile organizes resistance. Operating from Romania, the Polish government in exile intensifies efforts to organize resistance against both occupiers. Roughly 30,000 Polish soldiers form the foundation of an exile army, while between 30,000 and 35,000 civilians continue crossing into Romania. Polish leaders focus on diplomatic negotiations with the United States, Britain, and France, seeking military assistance and political recognition. 9 p.m., a new phase of exile resistance. The Polish government in exile enters a critical phase of planning long-term resistance. Diplomatic talks with Western powers accelerate as Poland seeks support for restoring independence. By nightfall, approximately 30,000 soldiers stand ready within the exile forces, while as many as 40,000 civilians have fled into Romania. The struggle for Poland's future has shifted entirely beyond its borders. Summary of September 24th, 1939. September 24th marks the transition from battlefield defeat to structured resistance in exile. Germany and the Soviet Union have fully secured control over Poland and begin implementing long-term occupation policies. Civilian casualties continue to rise, and mass displacement intensifies. Meanwhile, the Polish government in exile commits to diplomatic and military efforts aimed at restoring national independence and sustaining resistance against the occupiers. September 25th, 1939, the Polish army in exile as Germany and the Soviet Union consolidate their control. 5 a.m. German operations on the Western Front. German armies under Generals von Rundstedt and Guderian continue securing the western and southern regions of Poland. Following the complete destruction of Polish defenses and the occupation of key cities such as Warsaw, Krakow, and Katowice, German forces focus on stabilizing occupied territories. Military rule gradually gives way to full administrative control as occupation authorities assume responsibility for governance. Approximately 350,000 German soldiers, supported by around 600 Panzer III and Panzer IV tanks and nearly 2,000 aircraft, maintain order and suppress any remaining signs of resistance. 9 a.m. The Soviet Army on the Eastern Front. With full control over eastern Poland, the Soviet Army under General Timoshenko reinforces its presence across former Polish territory. Communist administration is rapidly implemented as Soviet forces take over civil institutions, infrastructure, and public services. Around 500,000 Soviet soldiers, supported by approximately 300 BT-7 and T-26 tanks and nearly 1,000 aircraft, enforce political and military authority throughout the region. Organized Polish resistance in the east has effectively ceased. 1 p.m. German losses in Warsaw and Krakow. After prolonged bombardments and ground assaults, German casualties during the sieges of Warsaw and Krakow remain limited. Polish forces no longer function as an effective fighting army. Roughly 1,200 German soldiers have been killed or wounded, while around 20 Panzer IV tanks have been damaged during the final engagements. German commanders now prioritize control, logistics, and administration over continued combat operations. 4 p.m. Civilian casualties in western Poland. Continued Luftwaffe air raids and ground actions lead to rising civilian deaths across Warsaw, Krakow, and Lwów. Between 8,000 and 10,000 civilians have been killed during bombardments and street fighting. Despite the danger, between 30,000 and 35,000 civilians attempt to flee toward Romania. Those remaining endure constant fear, destruction of homes, and the beginning of life under harsh occupation. 6 p.m. The Polish government in exile and diplomatic negotiations. Operating from Romania, the Polish government in exile intensifies diplomatic efforts to secure military and political support from major powers. Approximately 30,000 Polish soldiers form the core of an emerging exile army, while a similar number of civilians continue crossing the border. Polish leaders pursue alliances with the United States, Britain, and France, preparing the foundations for long-term resistance against both occupiers. 9 p.m. Planning the next phase of resistance. As night falls, the Polish government in exile focuses on planning future resistance operations from abroad. Diplomatic talks with Western allies continue as officials seek recognition, resources, and military assistance. Around 30,000 soldiers remain organized within exile forces, while as many as 40,000 civilians have reached safety in Romania. The struggle for Poland now exists entirely beyond its occupied borders. Summary of September 25, 1939. September 25th marks a critical phase in Poland's transition from battlefield defeat to organized resistance in exile. Germany and the Soviet Union fully consolidate control over Polish territory, dividing the country between them. Civilian casualties continue to rise, displacement accelerates, and occupation regimes take shape. Meanwhile, the Polish government and army in exile commit to diplomatic action and long-term resistance, determined to continue the fight for independence from abroad. September 26, 1939, the Polish army in exile as Germany and the Soviet Union tighten their grip. 5 a.m. German operations on the Western Front. German armies continue securing the last remaining regions of Western Poland. Divisions focused on administrative control expand occupation policies, implementing the National Socialist system across captured territories. With Warsaw, Krakow, Katowice, and other major urban centers already in German hands, the Wehrmacht prepares for total domination over all remaining Polish lands. Around 350,000 German soldiers, supported by 600 Panzer III and Panzer IV tanks, and nearly 2,000 aircraft, maintain bombardments, ground patrols, and the consolidation of political power. 9 a.m. The Soviet Army on the Eastern Front. Having fully occupied eastern Poland, the Soviet Army under General Timoshenko intensifies efforts to establish a communist administrative system. Political commissars, intelligence officers, and military administrators begin restructuring governance, law enforcement, and public institutions. Approximately 500,000 Soviet soldiers, supported by 300 BT-7 and T-26 tanks and 1,000 aircraft, enforce complete Soviet authority across the region. 1 p.m. German casualties in Warsaw and Krakow. After prolonged bombardment and the collapse of Polish defensive lines, German losses remain comparatively low. Polish resistance has ceased to function as an organized military force. Around 1,500 German soldiers have been killed or wounded, and approximately 40 Panzer IV tanks have been damaged during close-quarters fighting. German divisions now focus on the full occupation and control of Polish territory. 4 p.m., civilian casualties in western Poland. Air raids, artillery strikes, and ground assaults continue to devastate civilian populations. Across Warsaw, Krakow, and Lwów, the number of civilian deaths rises sharply. Between 10,000 and 12,000 civilians have been killed as bombardments destroy residential districts, hospitals, and evacuation routes. Despite the danger, between 40,000 and 50,000 civilians attempt to flee toward Romania, facing violence, chaos, and the collapse of civil order. 6 p.m., the Polish government in exile and ongoing diplomacy. From Romania, the Polish government in exile intensifies diplomatic negotiations with the United States, Britain, and France, seeking military and material assistance to rebuild resistance forces. Roughly 30,000 Polish soldiers form the core of the exile army, while tens of thousands of civilians continue to cross the border. The government prepares long-term strategies aimed at restoring independence and resisting both occupying powers. 9 p.m., organizing the next stage of resistance. As evening falls, the government in exile works to strengthen political leadership and coordinate future operations. Plans focus on expanding the exile army, establishing intelligence networks, and deepening ties with Western allies. Around 30,000 soldiers remain ready within the exile military structure, while between 35,000 and 40,000 civilians have taken refuge in Romania. The struggle for Poland continues abroad as the country itself is divided and controlled by totalitarian regimes. Summary of September 26, 1939. September 26th marks another day in which the Polish government in exile and the forming Polish exile army prepare for long-term resistance. German and Soviet forces have fully occupied Poland, implementing oppressive administrative systems and eliminating internal resistance. Civilian casualties continue to rise, and mass displacement intensifies. From abroad, Polish leaders work to secure international support and plan the eventual liberation of their homeland. September 27, 1939, the Polish army in exile as Germany and the Soviet Union consolidate control. 5 a.m., German operations on the Western Front. German armies, having fully conquered Western Poland, now focus on securing and administering occupied territories. Following the fall of Warsaw, Krakow, Katowice, and other major cities, German divisions carry out administrative operations to enforce Nazi rule. Military authorities, police units, and occupation officials work to stabilize control over the country. Around 350,000 German soldiers, supported by 600 Panzer III and Panzer IV tanks and approximately 2,000 aircraft, maintain dominance through patrols, enforcement actions, and continued military presence. 9 a.m., the Soviet Army on the Eastern Front. Under the command of General Timoshenko, the Soviet Army continues organizational operations across eastern Poland, which is now entirely under communist control. Soviet forces establish political administration, implement ideological restructuring, and secure strategic locations. Roughly 500,000 Soviet soldiers, equipped with 300 BT-7 and T-26 tanks and 1,000 aircraft, enforce full Soviet authority throughout the region. 1 p.m., German casualties. During the sieges of Warsaw and Krakow, after days of heavy fighting and sustained bombardment, German losses remain limited. With the Polish army destroyed and organized resistance collapsed, only isolated engagements occur. Approximately 1,000 German soldiers have been killed or wounded, and about 20 Panzer IV tanks have been damaged. German forces now face little opposition and exercise uncontested control across the country. 4 p.m., civilian casualties in western Poland. Continuous bombing and ground assaults continue to devastate civilian populations in Warsaw, Krakow, and Lwów. Residential districts lie in ruins as artillery fire and air raids strike non-military targets. Between 8,000 and 10,000 civilians have been killed. Despite the danger, between 30,000 and 35,000 people attempt to flee toward Romania, often under fire and without protection. 6 p.m., the Polish government in exile and diplomatic negotiations. From Romania, the Polish government in exile intensifies diplomatic efforts with Britain, France, and the United States. Officials seek military aid, political recognition, and assistance in rebuilding an armed force abroad. Roughly 30,000 Polish soldiers form the core of the exile army, while tens of thousands of civilians continue to cross the border after escaping occupied territory. 9 p.m., planning the next phase of resistance. As night falls, the Polish leadership abroad continues organizing resistance against both occupying powers. Diplomatic negotiations accelerate, and preparations begin for future military operations coordinated with Western allies. Around 30,000 Polish soldiers remain under exile command, while between 35,000 and 40,000 civilians shelter in Romania. The fight for Poland shifts beyond its borders, marking the beginning of long-term resistance from abroad. Summary of September 27th, 1939. September 27th marks the final consolidation of German and Soviet control over Poland. The Polish army no longer exists inside the country, and Polish territory is entirely occupied. From exile, the Polish government and military leadership commit to continued resistance through diplomacy, alliance building, and the organization of armed forces abroad. Civilian suffering continues to rise, but Poland's struggle now enters a new phase beyond its borders.